Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennett Street School, where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, we want to thank the many supporters that make our programs possible, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council and our partners in craft. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Kristen Odell. I'm an NBSS staff member and host of In the Making. Today, we're speaking with Carolyn Finn, a 2013 graduate of the Cabinet Furniture Making program, and currently a conservator with Christopher Shelton Conservation. Thank you for spending the day with us, Carolyn.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and we'll get into what this piece of furniture is later in the program. It's serving as our prop, and we'll get into it in a bit. Let's just start with you telling us about how you ended up in this field.
Sure. It was a bit of a roundabout journey. I started as a product design major in college. And got to take furniture as part of that, and fell in love with furniture, and decided that one of the best ways to, design furniture at the time was to actually know how to make it. So that's what led me to North Bennett instead of just going straight into furniture design. But being here and seeing all the traditional techniques that we learn here, I fell in love with the history of furniture making. It's fascinating fields, and there's a lot of creative solutions that they used in the past for making furniture, especially with the tools they had at the time. So it's always a joy to see what people have done and how they've made furniture throughout history. Thanks.
Thank you. When you were studying product design, were you headed in a specific direction? Was it the opposite end of period furniture?
Very much so at the time. I thought I would be making modern furniture, or even just products out of wood at the time. My furniture professor at the time, we did a bunch of things. We made tables, but we would also have to do three-dimensional, sculptures and carving, using power tools. It's like I made a head with an angle grinder one day for a project. It's like it was all sorts of various wood projects. So I did not think I would end up here when I was in college.
Can you trace back to the first project you were working on here that sort of sparked that love for period furniture and what it was about that?
Yeah, I mean, it probably wasn't until my second year. We did the chip and jail chair and the footstool at the time, and working with Steve Brown on those projects. He was plugged in to the conservation community at the time. He was doing a lot of work with Winchester, cataloging their furniture and doing measurements of various chairs. And so that was kind of my introduction into the fact that conservation even existed. Because I was like, well, people repair furniture, but there's a whole field and techniques. Conservation and restoration are not the same thing.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. Actually, let's land there now. Can you explain the difference between the two?
Sure. Restoration tends to basically restore pieces back to what they would have looked like originally. Versus conservation, we try and keep as much of the existing or original material as possible on the furniture. So instead of, stripping a piece of furniture to refinish it so it looks beautiful, we'll rejuvenate the finish that's existing and still make it look really nice, but it'll just look like, our tagline is basically, it looks like a well cared for antique.
And you said earlier to me that, how did you language this, that a good conservator is someone you never know is there? Or how did you word that?
The best conservators, their work is invisible. And you would never know that they did any work. Because really, you've got to balance the value of the piece versus the cost of our work. And a lot of times our work could decrease the value of the piece. But we're doing veneer patches, we're doing finish work, and it's all stuff that basically, you don't want to know that we did anything. It wants to just blend seamlessly without catching your eye.
We've talked, well, I've spoken with various instructors around the building before about maker's marks. Is there an instance in a repair job that you're doing or a conservation project where you you intentionally, leave something just exactly as it is.
Yeah, Maker's Mark is actually a really good example of that. We've run into a lot of signatures and writing on pieces, a lot of times on the backs or underneath, drawer bottoms or things like that. And we try not to touch those. We'll take good photography if possible, so it's well documented. We need to do infrared photography for really faint pencil marks, basically as much documentation as possible. But then, I don't want to clean right there because I don't want to clean off the marks because that's part of the history and the provenance of the piece. So, there's been times that I've covered it with Mylar plastic so that it's protected, or just make sure that it's cleaned all the way around it and you can still see it, and it's there to live in perpetuity.
This is a ridiculous question. I'm imagining appraisal CSI situations where is that an instance where you cannot remove any finish because there's some actual chemical diagnoses going on? Have you ever run into that on something?
I have not run into that.
Or aging, determining an age of a piece of furniture or something like that.
We do finish microscopy at times and paint analysis, as well as wood identification. So there have been a few cases where we've needed to do finish identification through the layers to see what the original finish was made of. And you can do that using various techniques, even in ultraviolet light. Different finishes fluoresce different colors. So it's a really easy way of telling what was there. And so then we can kind of inform ourselves if we need to put on specific finishes, or if, even just as simple as, whatever we're putting on needs to actually stick to what's there. Because whatever we do will adhere and interact with whatever's existing on the piece.
Right.
So we have to be kind of careful with that.
I'm going to jump back to your trajectory from product design to North Bennett and then to the museum studies program at Harvard.
Sure.
Is that the order?
Yes.
Okay. So you came to North Bennett, and then you were the footstool is what sort of sparked this love of period furniture. Did you then go into the museum studies program at Harvard with the sole intention on furniture conservation as your career path?
Yes,
Yeah.
I was already working. I worked for Robert Mussey Associates at the time before it became Christopher Shelton Conservation, and I was working full-time there with the intent that I would still go to grad school, and so I was trying to inform myself more on the field by taking the museum studies classes at Harvard, because their certificate programs are great and you can just take them and then you don't have to apply.
Got it. They're just it's just courses, continuing education
exactly.
sort of thing. Yeah. And then that builds up your resume to then be able to go and work for a conservator?
To go into a graduate program.
Graduate program, right, okay. And then what was the graduate program?
So there's two big ones. There's the Winterthur Museum, which is part of the University of Delaware, and then there's SUNY Buffalo also has one. And I was applying to both of those at the time.
Right, and you ended up.
I did not actually end up going to grad school.
Got it. Sorry, I didn't.
I was in.
We'll cut that out.
It's
I'm just kidding.
No. I was already in the field.
You didn't. Yeah, you didn't need to.
Yeah, it's like the hand skills that I learned here at North Bennett. You can do the work. It's just the knowledge of what to do at times is what I learned on the job, and what I would have learned if I had gone to grad school. But at this point, I do the work and I can do the work.
Right. Well, you're just making me think of the difference between, we have some graduates from bookbinding, for example, who've gone to SUNY Buffalo's conservation program. And I think of that as such a wildly different set of tools needed in, paper conservation, where you're dealing with molecular levels of material, and the hand skills needed to work on, physical wood objects that you would need in your career. So I can see the difference, and that you wouldn't need that. Yeah. What was something that I didn't prepare you for this question, but what's something when you took the coursework at Harvard transitioning from North Bennett, taking your hand skills to the museum studies program at Harvard, what's something that you learned there that was sort of like, oh my gosh, now my world has opened into furniture conservation?
I remember one class was on house museums, which we do a lot of work for house museums, so it was very applicable at the time. And I had to contact a house museum and talk with their curator, or basically their person running the museum, just to, learn about how it works and how they deal with conservation issues. Because a lot of times house museums don't have staff for conservation, which is why we do a lot of work for them. So it was, it was interesting kind of learning more about the ins and outs of the museum world. Because I talked to one of the historic New England houses. So, they're a really big.
Yes, they have a lot of
operation. Yes, quite a few. Yeah.
What was one that you went to and that sort of shaped your path in this?
Oh, one of them was the Otis House here in Boston, which is nice. And they've done a lot of work there recently to kind of modernize the experience there. But I cannot remember the name of the house, but they have a Victorian house that's north of us, either in New Hampshire or Vermont, that's pink. And it's got a lot of traditional, historic furniture in it. And it's set up as it would have been at the time. And, at the time, I thought of a lot of houses of the period. You think of them as being dark because there's not a lot of lighting, it's candles, it's, all sorts of dark surfaces, but they would paint things to be very bright so that their lives had color.
I love that. In your own words, what excites you most about extending the life of an object through conservation?
I have the pleasure of working on a lot of things that are very old, where we work on everything pre-1900, but I've worked on some things from the 18th century, and they survive and they're still functional pieces of furniture. And, keeping them functional is just, it's a joy because, it's like they've lasted for hundreds of years already. And I just want to help make sure that they continue to last for hundreds of years more, hopefully.
I asked you sort of or at a different time, if that was, is it an emotional response to an object that keeps that going for you? Or is it, deference and respect for the, like what joinery does?
It's probably a mixture of both. The work I do, it's basically, seeing something get conserved and brought back so that it's functional is, it's a great experience. But it's interesting because when I work on something, I very rarely am doing the same thing twice. So it's always a little bit of a puzzle of how I'm going to actually, do the work. It's even if I'm just doing veneer patches, nothing is ever the same shape or size, or even wood. And sometimes I can't find the woods that they used at the time. So you have to find other species that will match. And so it's always a little bit of a mystery and a puzzle for the actual process of the work.
So the creative problem solving is pretty joyful for you. Yeah. Where do you think that you had an interest or an appreciation for creative, like that was driving you in your early days of product design, or is that something that you picked up here?
I think I've probably always enjoyed the process of things a lot. I've always enjoyed working with my hands and creating. So being able to apply it to something where it's not just, or I'm getting to use my brain a little bit more about like trying to think of how I'm going to actually work on something. That's been a pleasure to do.
That might answer my next question, but then I'm going to ask you to get more granular into the chemical not chemical, but
Sure.
into the weeds. What is your favorite part of the conservation process? You just said bigger picture, it's the creative puzzle problem solving. Day to day, what's just like a technique that you apply to everything that is one of your most favorite things?
I mean, I think I really like, well, I know I really like the woodworking side of things, you know, coming out of North Bennett. I have those hand skills. It's what I know. And there are times when, for example, I'm working on something that's carved and I need to replace carved elements, but I need to do it with the hand of the person that basically has carved it. So, you know, I'm trying to remove my carving techniques and recreate what this person, however long ago, did.
Can you give an example of seeing something? I mean, maybe even if it's this, what would you see on that is specific to the original hand that carved it that you would try to emulate?
Well, this, for example, it's smooth. It's very well carved and the detail is still there. So sometimes when I'm working on other things, there's a lot more facets still. It's a, you know, rougher kind of carving. Say if it's something architectural, you know, or even just that you won't see as much. So like for this, you know, in this case, I would need to do this, you know, to be very smooth and clean, because you're going to see when the finish is on, you'll see all of the, you know, the knuckles and everything. They'll be nice and defined, and you know, like this one still has its finish on it. So looking at it, and you still see the highlights of the finish going over the carving and the ball. It's all very smooth, very even. So I would try and recreate that basically.
Have you ever had something like you said that's architectural that is maybe a little bit more rough because it's seen from further away, that you've had to simulate, you know, like change the way your hand is holding a tool? Is that
somewhat, yeah. I mean, every time I have to do any sort of carving, it's a process of figuring out like, okay, so, you know, I can sometimes see even the tool marks and be like, all right, I need to use this sweep of gouge to do this specific, you know, shape. And in the case of architectural work, you know, a lot of times it's like 40 feet up in the air and you don't see a lot of that detail. So it's getting the big picture on those carvings and then recreating that so that, you know, you see basically the same highlights that you would with the original.
Can you tell us about the most meaningful object you've ever worked on?
Sure.
Or a few of them. I know one that we'll hear about.
Sure. The first one that comes to mind is a Chicago's Defender's Desk. It's at the African American Museum in DC. And it was a big project because it had come out of a storage space that had a leak and was blanket wrapped, and unfortunately the water got on the surface and all of the veneered top was peeling and water damaged. So we had to fix that and use what was there to get it back to, you know, presentation worthy. But working on that one, it would, I mean, not just the fact that it was a big project, but it also has this history. That's the one that always comes to mind first.
Yeah. From a place of the project was incredible, or just the meaning of the desk?
I think it's both.
Yeah.
You know, it's not often that we get pieces that have had this kind of, you know, not damage, but just wear, where something acute has happened, like the water came onto the blanket and it made the whole top start to peel up because it was veneered. You know, that we don't often get those big projects where there is a really dramatic before and after of, here's a piece of furniture, it looks really rough, kind of like this guy. And here is the after of, oh, it is a functional, fully working piece of furniture that is now, you know, beautiful and capable of being viewed by however many people the museum gets.
What is the most outrageous thing or largest or something that is like sticks in your mind as just a beast that you can't shake, like you'll never forget it in a not a great way.
Well, I don't know that I have any bad projects.
Mhm.
One of my biggest projects was an arc in a temple here in Boston. That is it was a 40-foot arc that was leafed in aluminum leaf. And at some point, someone had come along and done like the bottom 8 feet in a different aluminum leaf.
Oh, nice.
So there was a line and you could tell the difference. So our job was to remove that, conserve what was underneath, and then put on a better match aluminum leaf. But we also had to clean the entire arc. So, you know, I was up there on a ladder, 40 feet in the air, scrubbing this 3-foot wide at that point arc. And I think that was a different project.
Being on the ladder, was that, I mean, I know I'm just picking that, but like, is that something that you had to get over to?
Heights are not
Yeah,
much. I'm good with heights.
Okay, okay.
It's more just, you know, the fact that you're up there doing, you know, very detailed work. Because I've also had to work on construction sites doing architectural work. There's a library that we did work on where I was in one of those, you know, personal lifts.
Yeah,
you just had
the
to go
cherry
up.
picker, is that what it's called? Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, was up on the ceiling, taking off degraded finish with tape because it came off that easily. And that was an interesting project as well. So
What is, I think about heights, like what's something that you didn't know about this industry that you kind of had to learn on the fly and just adapt to?
well, at least at my company that I worked for, you know, furniture encompasses a lot of materials and not just wood. So I've conserved weather vanes, I've conserved hardware, ironwork, I've conserved stone. And there's a lot more materials than I would have expected being in a furniture conservation space. We run into paper every once in a while.
In what instance did stone come into play?
They're blue john, which is a type of stone, that they were these turned blue john little vases, or basically vases. They didn't open, but they just kind of sit and they're decorative, and the ball at the top had come off and we needed to make a new one, and there were some chips, and so you just needed to recreate those pieces as well.
Can you share any insight into the historic spaces you've had the opportunity to work in?
Sure. As I've said, I've worked for a lot of house museums, and also just institutions in general. We've done work for the Emily Dickinson House out in Amherst. We've done work for the African American Museum in DC. We've done work for Longyear here in Boston. It kind of ranges. We've done some work at the Quincy Homestead, and actually had to work on their room and their walls because they're wood, and redo their paint for that, basically, like they would have done historically. So
I don't know if anybody remembers, Carolyn was here recently working on a chair that had originally been worked on here or built here. We tried to find another lolling chair for her to use as a prop. That's an example of something that went into an institutional space that's sat on by the public. Is that by the public or by one person specifically?
that's the public.
Yeah, okay.
So, yes, thousands of people might sit on that chair.
Yeah, okay.
That doesn't happen as often, at least in a lot of the house museums. A lot of our furniture does not actually have to get sat on. But it happens, you know, we do work for private clients as well, and they need to still use their furniture, you know, it's their dining set, or it's their lolling chair, or whatever it is, table.
So that piece is what sparked this conversation because it had both wood and textile upholstery components, and upholstery work is kind of a small piece of the curriculum here.
Mm-hmm.
And so how much of that is involved in your work? And did you have to learn how to sew? Did you have to learn that whole technique?
Yeah, I did. I learned it on the job.
Mhm.
You know, kind of did it piecemeal, building up over time. You know, it'd start out learning how to sew seams, basically, and you know,
By hand, not on a machine.
we do some on a machine, but I largely do seams by hand.
Mhm.
You know, it'll be sewing up pillowcases, or it's in the case of the lolling chair, the whole back is sewn on basically, and learning how to do those stitches so that you don't actually see the stitches. And it's just those techniques I learned on the job, and it just kind of depended on what came in the door.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that you patented any? Is there any kind of new technique in that you?
I don't think I probably patented anything. You know, we're using traditional techniques.
Mhm.
These are things that like I can go to a book and be like, all right, how do I do this not again?
Yeah,
because I haven't done it in 2 years.
Yeah.
So you know, it's like I don't think I've recreated the wheel here.
I have another kind of maybe silly question. That chair was velvet, was it? Is velvet used in that kind of situation, not only because it's comfortable and soft, but because it can hide stitch work? Is that one reason?
It could be. It was also, you know, it was the aesthetic at the time. I've done some other velvet furniture. It has not come up a lot though. We work with a lot of wool or silks or horsehair fabrics more than velvet. But it's just basically, you know, whatever was period appropriate. I use on most of our work.
Do you ever have the urge to work on, and maybe this is an object that doesn't come through your doors because your company is known for period furniture conservation? Do you ever have the urge or the fantasy for something just extremely, you know, modern and boxy and to come through your door?
We've had a couple more modern pieces come through, where it's been like foam upholstery. They are rare, and they're rare.
You want to say something, but
I enjoy working on the horsehair and the traditional. Foam is hard to work with, and it also degrades very quickly. So you know, I can work with
it degrades in a gross way.
It does. Yes, taking apart the upholstery with foam is not my favorite thing. Granted, horsehair, you know, some of those things, they get really dirty in there after hundreds of years, but we can reuse it and we can clean it. And then, you know, we don't have to completely remake the foundation. We can reuse some of the original foundations if possible.
How do you clean the horsehair padding in the?
You can send it out to be cleaned. But also typically if it came off the piece, it can go back on the piece. So, you know, sometimes it's just a matter of shaking it out, or, you know, we're going to put new horsehair on anyways to help reshape it because it's probably just compressed so much after so many years, that we can just kind of regulate it and get it to work again.
Question about tools, because you have a lot of your tools here that you'll probably talk to us about with this, but when you were a student here, what was your most used and most connected tool? And in your practice now, what is your most used and most connected tool? And you can't list your hands, that's a given.
Sure.
Don't do that. We know.
Well, here I probably used my hand planes a lot more than I do now. You know, the number 4 and the number 7, they do a lot of work getting things up to snuff up here. Now, you know, nothing is square, nothing is straight. So I do a lot of work with chisels and smaller planes, block planes, and I even brought in my smallest tiny block plane.
The orange one?
Yes.
It's a beauty.
Yeah, it's this tiny guy.
Gets
a lot more work than anything else.
Yeah.
In my plane catalog. So that those are the big things.
Question for this room, and then I'll ask you, Carolyn, is anybody in this space who, for a virtual audience, this is cabinet and furniture, students are all around us right now. Is anyone curious about going into this path? Conservation? Okay, so there's a few of us. What is something that you would say to these students about going into that?
You have the skills coming out of North Bennett to do the work. It's just finding a place where you're able to do it and learn the techniques needed in order to actually, do the work. I had the benefit of going to work for Robert Mussey Associates at the time and learn under my two bosses, who both had two different styles of work. One of them came through this program and then did grad school. One of them came out of Winterthur completely and came through that vein. So, it's, you can do the work coming out of North Bennett. It's then just all of the, the little techniques and products even that need to get used. It's just kind of knowing what's out there that you can just learn.
Is there anything that you would say about, and I don't want to put the curriculum on the block here, but because instructors are here, but is there anything that you would say that you wish you had practiced more or exercised more when you were in the 2-year program here that would have prepared you more for what you're doing in conservation?
Well, I mean, like I said, I like woodworking, and you learn that here, by far. But there are a lot of other skills that are needed, like upholstery in particular is one that, you're making chairs. You should at least know kind of how upholstery works. Because I've run into pieces, take sofas, for example. There is a wide range of ways to make a sofa, and some of them are very underbuilt. Or they have really hard pass-throughs to pass the fabric through that I'm having to just really lean on it to get it to go through. And it's knowing some of those tricks and things like that would benefit. I think students would benefit from.
What about finish work? I mean, I know that a lot of finishing education happens in here. Is there any of that in your practice where you're sort of backtracking?
I think finish work is well done here, because you learn how to do it traditionally, like French polishing with shellac. I do a fair amount of shellac work. That is probably our most used finish. Then you get your water locks and your oils. And occasionally we do use modern finishes, but we're using the kind of the standard finishes that might be more on hand here, and that you might still be using making furniture. So it's it's just the techniques of knowing how to put it on properly, and you get that here. It's pieces come out and they're beautiful.
They are. Yeah, your work is beautiful. One last question for you before we jump to this piece. Are you making any room furniture?
Not as much these days. Just don't quite have the time. I've made a few dining tables for some friends and family, and some smaller pieces, but I'd like to get back into it. It's just finding the time is a challenge.
Yeah. Okay, for everybody here in person and virtually, we're going to talk about this piece of furniture right here. So, but get your questions ready and go ahead and feed them to us, and we'll get to them as soon as we're at the end of talking about this. This is a Boston block front chest, likely made between 1760 and 1780, that was brought to us by our friend Ron Trapazzo, who's a furniture restorer on the North Shore. Using this piece as our prop, can you guide us through your intake process if someone dropped this in your shop?
Sure. I mean, as you can see, it needs a lot of work.
You would say no.
It needs a lot of love. Well, no, it's a balancing act. Our work is not cheap. It is highly skilled. So you really have to balance the cost of the work versus the actual value of the piece. This one would be expensive enough that it would need to have some sentimental value. Or someone would just need to really want to make it functional.
Did you just say this, because you said it before, like, we're talking thousands of dollars?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thousands of dollars to repair this piece. It is, most of the joints need repair. It is in pieces underneath. There might be missing pieces that need to be recreated. Most of the drawers are just drawer fronts right now. They need to be already rebuilt.
Can we pause there for a second and ask, I want to ask how you, and maybe you don't have a crisp answer to this. You're gonna have to tell a client thousands of dollars to make this true again and weighing their emotional investment in it. How do you navigate that kind of nuanced conversation around how much do you really love this? And
I have the benefit of being the assistant
there
conservator.
you go. That's right.
So I don't deal with this quite as often, but it does come up. A lot of times if people are coming to us, they have an investment in the piece of furniture. Very rarely is it something that's just like, hey, it's my chair and I just need it to be fixed and y'all are close by.
Right.
We're working for institutions or collectors, if they're private. And so they have
They know.
yes, then they want it to be right. And are sometimes very particular about what it looks like. Because a lot of times they do know, and they know what it should look like and, its history. So, this probably would not come to our shop unless someone, was very invested in it.
So sorry to interrupt. Through your intake process, you would be things that would jump out at you.
Yeah, so, the whole case racks from side to side. I could push it over at this point. Most of the joints are loose. The drawers need to be rebuilt. There's quite a bit of finish issues. We're missing 2 legs. So there's a lot of work to be done. And we would note all of this. We make a very detailed condition assessment when pieces come in, and we take a lot of photography so that we have those before pictures. Not just for the client, but also for ourselves. And so, we would have a list of everything that needs to be fixed on this piece. And then we would go through and we would itemize it basically and figure out, how long do we think it's going to take to rebuild all the drawers? Or to, in the case of like veneer patches, which this doesn't have as many, but, how long do I think it'll take me to do each veneer patch? And we'll just tally it up and figure out how many hours that takes, and that's our number.
And the biggest cost in restoration, this is a restoration project, is just labor.
Yeah, materials costs are added on, but they are minimal compared to the
Yeah.
labor costs.
Yeah. And how long do you think if I brought this to you and said, yes, let's move forward, how long would it be?
This could take several months to redo. Some of that is drying time for finish. Because honestly, the finishing can take a long time, even though I'm only working on it for an hour a day. It is over weeks of time, depending on how filled finishes and things like that. But it would probably be a couple months of work to fix.
Yeah.
Not continuous, but to fix.
And your honest take right now, live, if someone did bring this to you, would you be sighing inside? Would you be like, please no, I would not.
This would be a lot of fun. I mean, I would love to do this. It's, it's fun to get to make legs. I don't always get to make a ball and claw foot these days, but it'd be fun to get to carve some more of them and to, do all the work to rebuild the drawers and also just find appropriate hardware for it. And it would be a pleasure to work on. It'd be a fun project.
Okay. So we have a taker. Any students here have questions for Carolyn that are thinking about conservation? Yeah.
You just mentioned hardware, and that makes me wonder how hard or easy it is to source historically correct hardware. Are there like fabricators now who follow those patterns, or do you do dead stock or like Is it getting harder?
There's a mix of both. There are definitely still companies that carry traditional period appropriate hardware. We source from a couple of them. A lot of them are in the States that we source from. And anything that we can't find, say there's a knob that has like a stamped detail on the front of it, those can be very specific. And we can send them out to get fabricated. Because we have some people that do metal work as well. Or they might just have them because they have quite the collection of antique hardware. So.
Yes, John?
A piece like that, where say on the frames that the dovetails were kind of shot on several of them. Are you rebuilding the whole frame, or are you scarfing wood on and recutting the dovetail to try and preserve that?
Yeah, these dovetails, they're loose, but they're actually in pretty good shape internally. They might not look it from the outside, but you know, they are still holding the piece together. So I would work with what's there as much as possible. If there was, say, a big chunk missing, that I would scarf in and just try and make it fit like it should.
What is to scarf?
Basically, it would be just patching in a new piece. So, you know, like the corner of this dovetail is missing, so I could make a piece that would fit it right there.
Got it. I have a question, unless anybody else has one.
No.
Oh, yeah, you go ahead.
Understanding the nature of time and, you know, the periodic schedule of restoring, are there any techniques or materials that you use that you would consider for the next restore somewhere down the line as far as?
Yeah, we think about that a lot, actually. A lot of times in conservation, you want your work to be invisible, but you also want it to be reversible. So there's certainly been some projects where I'm thinking about, like, if I have to conserve this in 25 years, do I really want to do this? Because it's going to be a giant pain to try and get it off. Finish is not one of those things a lot of times, but you know, it'll be things like, even say if I were to patch in something, I might, what we would call barrier coat the wood between the patch and the existing wood. That way, if it fails, it will fail on the wood joint or on the glue joint instead of on the wood next to it. So it would be, you know, it's things like that we do think about a lot.
I think that's like golden rule number one in conservation, isn't it? Is
Mhm.
always be reversible.
Yes, yeah, you don't want to affect the original material as much as possible. You know, if I'm like repairing a chair leg and the joint is just completely broken and in 1,000 pieces, I will patch in a new piece of wood. And then I might have to take away some of the original to make sure that I get something that's strong enough to function. But I will do as little as possible.
I always find it so funny to hear of in some, even in piano technology, and something you just mentioned here, and I've heard it in violin, colleagues working on a cello neck repair right now. And there's a violent part before sort of the working on rebuilding something, like the ripping wood away, you know, damaged wood, or just like stripping it out. There's like this violent moment, I think of, before there's the pristine, you know, delicate, reversible work done. And I hear even in piano technology, the way they have to rip out a soundboard before they rebuild it, it's just really funny to me. Yeah, not the violence part, but it's just like the difference is really funny to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we're super violent.
Yeah, I know. We can use a different word.
No, I'm just thinking about, like, there have been times when I need to actually knock apart a chair in order to glue it back together properly.
That's what I'm talking about.
But, you know, I'm using a mallet, but I have a block of wood between it and the actual wood of the chair. So even though I'm being fairly aggressive, you know, you're still doing it in ways that protect the piece.
Yeah. My question was about collaboration. You mentioned the hardware piece where you might have to source something specific. is there some other group that you can think of that you collaborate with frequently in your work? You know,
Sure.
metalsmiths or, you know.
Yeah, we've, there've been a few cases recently where we've had to work with a textile conservator on things because we've been working on beds that have, you know, 4-corner post beds that have drapery, that go around the bed itself. And so we're working with them to figure out how they want to hang the very, you know, the antique fabric basically. And so we're having to build like, you know, the frame that it is hung off of on the bed. And that's one case we've worked with. We also work with some carvers as well. You know, for things where it's just like, well, I could do this, but they can do it faster and cheaper.
Yeah.
You know, so things like that.
Yeah, got it. A question from a virtual guest. Any suggestions on how to get started with veneer repairs?
Sure. Well, find some veneer is the first big thing. No, but the big thing with veneer repairs, my biggest advice for it, if you're trying to, you know, patch in a new piece of veneer, try and make sure it's not just blunted against the grain. So if the grain is running in one direction, don't have your piece end perpendicular to that grain orientation because you will see the line. And so, you know, even if you just make it at an angle or like little houses, think about your grain orientation and think about, you know, how the line of the patch is going to end up.
Is it similar? Okay, let me try to read this question properly. The question is about high glues and consolidant used for wallpaper or paint. Is it similar hide glues and okay. Similar materials used for wallpaper or paint? I'm not sure how.
Wallpaper, I think, is typically used with a water-based paste. Although I haven't done a lot of work with wallpaper, so don't hold me to that one. But hide glues, there are different types of hide glues, and there's also different, you know, they have different, they adhere to different materials and they have different tacky qualities. For example, there's your traditional hot hide glue, which is what is used in joints for wood. Then there's rabbit skin glue, which has lower, like it doesn't hold as much, that we use for things like, you know, inlay, metal inlay is one of them, where there's very delicate pieces that don't need to be structural as much. And then there's even things like fish glue, which I think I've used once in my career. Also used for metals in that case, I think. So yeah, there's different types of glues that are used, but I would say that wallpaper glue and the glue that we're using in furniture are not the same thing.
Okay, and what do you use to adhere veneer
you try and use it basically almost only hide glue, unless it's a more modern piece or just won't hold as well as we think. Sometimes that's because it's been repaired with other modern glues like epoxy.
Got it. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
I'm curious about how much power tools and machines factor into your work, especially when you're trying to be period specific. And you've mentioned using chisels and planes and doing quite a bit of handwork, but I'm also curious, like, where do machines factor in when you're trying to be cognizant of what's going on with the piece?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we certainly do still have power tools. You know, we've got a table saw, planer, joiner, you know, your standard stuff. I mostly use them to make the patches that are going on. I'm not ever really cutting anything off of the piece, unless I really need to. But for the most part, everything that's going on the piece is ending up being tooled by hand, or honestly, a belt sander has been one of the major power tools that I've used for some of those, you know, abnormal patch shapes. It's just a lot easier to just take it to the sander and be done with it.
Yeah.
Kind of an odd question maybe, but with all of the different periods and pieces and styles and things that you work on, How do you choose to furnish your own?
I asked you this right here.
Yeah, I don't live with any period furniture. It would feel a bit like work.
That's a great question.
Yeah,
Probably not ideal.
I think I've phased out all of my IKEA furniture at this point, actually. I try and look for things that are solid wood, that will last. But I'm a big fan of mid-century modern furniture, actually, so that's kind of where my style goes. But no, I do not live with any of the old brown furniture.
Okay, anyone else? Yes.
When you finish a piece, do you leave explicit documentation with it so that in theory, if it didn't get lost, the next restorer 100 years from now could see exactly what you did?
Yeah, we do. We do a full treatment report of everything we did on the piece with pictures at the end of our projects. So it's there, and hopefully whoever has the piece will have kept it with the piece, but at least that way, hopefully it'll still be there for the next conservator.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, that's our program. Thank you all for being here. Carolyn, thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care.